I'm a 23-year-old guy, and for most of my life, it's just been me and my mom. My parents split up when I was 12, and after that, my dad pretty much faded out of the picture. Mom and I were close, like too close. At first, it felt nice having that bond. She always said I was her rock, her reason to keep going. But as I got older, it started feeling more like I was carrying the weight of her world on my shoulders. Growing up, she was always there. Like always. If I was out with friends, she'd call to check in. If I stayed up late, she'd wait up just to make sure I was safe. I thought it was normal for a while, but by the time I hit college, it was clear she was more attached to me than other parents were to their kids. When I tried to set boundaries, it just made her clingier. She'd say things like, "You're all I have," or "I don't know what I'd do without you." Fast forward to this year, I got offered my dream job in a big city 2 states away. The opportunity was everything I'd worked for: better pay, more growth, and a chance to finally have my own space. When I told her about it, she smiled and said she was proud of me. She even joked about how much she'd miss my cooking. For a moment, I thought she was handling it well. As I started prepping for the move, though, things got weird. At first, it was subtle. She'd tear up over random stuff, like me packing old clothes, saying they reminded her of when I was a kid. Then it turned into guilt tripping. Every other sentence was something like, "I just hope you won't forget about me," or "It's going to be so quiet here without you." I brushed it off, thinking she just needed time to adjust. Then she started poking holes in my plans. She asked about my salary and acted shocked, saying it wouldn't be enough to cover rent and groceries. She kept questioning if my new job was stable, or if I was making a mistake moving so far. At one point, she even suggested I could commute from home, even though the city was a 5-hour drive. 2 weeks before I was set to leave, she dropped the bombshell. She'd been feeling off lately and decided to see a doctor. She didn't say much at first, just that she was waiting on test results. I offered to go with her to the follow-up, and that's when the drama started. She told the doctor she was having all these symptoms: dizziness, fatigue, trouble breathing. They ran a ton of tests, but nothing conclusive came back. That didn't stop her from acting like she was at death's door. From that point on, everything revolved around her illness. She'd grown about being too tired to cook or clean, so I picked up the slack. Every time I tried to work on my move, calling about the lease, packing boxes, she'd find a way to interrupt. She even made me cancel plans with friends to drive her to a second opinion appointment. The new doctor couldn't find anything serious either, but she latched onto one vague comment about a possible condition that might require lifestyle changes. That night, she sat me down and said she couldn't manage on her own anymore. She begged me to stay, saying it wasn't fair to leave her when she needed me most. She looked so fragile sitting there, holding her tea with trembling hands, and for a second, I considered it. But then I noticed something strange. Earlier that day, she'd eaten a slice of cake and had a glass of wine, things she claimed her condition made her unable to handle. I started paying closer attention after that. The next morning, I caught her laughing on the phone with a friend, sounding perfectly fine. When she saw me, she immediately hunched over and started coughing. It didn't add up. I confronted her gently, asking if the doctors had given her a clear diagnosis. She got defensive, saying I was accusing her of lying. She even cried, calling me ungrateful for doubting her. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about her health. It was about control. She didn't want me to leave, and she was willing to do whatever it took to keep me here. The guilt was almost unbearable, but deep down I knew if I gave in now, I'd never get out. I told her I was sorry she wasn't feeling well, but I had to move. She stormed off, slamming the door, and we didn't talk for 2 days. When moving day came, it was chaos. She stood in the driveway as I loaded the truck, sobbing loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. She kept saying things like, "I guess this is goodbye forever, and you're leaving me to die alone." My hands were shaking as I packed the last box, but I didn't stop. I gave her a hug before I left, but she didn't hug back. She just stood there crying as I drove away. As I pulled onto the highway, a mix of relief and guilt washed over me. I knew this was just the beginning of the fallout, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. Update 1. When I arrived in the city, the first thing I did was unpack enough to make the apartment livable. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom with creaky floors and an ancient radiator, but it was mine. The quiet was strange at first, almost unsettling after years of living with someone who was always hovering. I didn't reach out to my mom for the first 2 weeks. Not because I was trying to be cruel, but because I needed time to focus on settling in, setting up utilities, starting my new job, and figuring out the subway system without getting hopelessly lost. The messages started the day after I moved in. At first, it was just a few texts. "Hope you made it safely, or let me know when you're free to talk." Harmless enough. I responded briefly, letting her know I was busy unpacking. But soon, the text became longer and more urgent. She said she wasn't feeling well, that her symptoms were getting worse. She called several times a day, leaving voicemails that alternated between guilt tripping and outright panic. She'd say things like, "I don't know what I'll do if you don't call me back," and "I might not be here much longer if this keeps up." When I didn't respond immediately, she escalated. I woke up one morning to find that she had texted several of my relatives, telling them I had abandoned her in her time of need. That's when the phone calls started from my aunts, uncles, and even a couple of cousins I hadn't talked to in years. They wanted to know why I wasn't helping my mom. One aunt told me I was being selfish, that family always comes first. Another said my mom had been crying on the phone, saying she felt like I didn't love her anymore. I didn't want to drag anyone else into it, so I kept my explanations vague. I said she wasn't as sick as she claimed, and that I needed to focus on my own life. That didn't go over well. Some of them told me I should have delayed the move, while others flat out accused me of being ungrateful after everything my mom had done for me. Thankfully, I had my friends. When I showed them some of the messages, they confirmed what I already suspected, that my mom was using her illness as a way to manipulate me. They reminded me that I had every right to live my own life, and that I wasn't responsible for managing her emotions. It was validating to hear, but the guilt was still there, hanging over me like a cloud. 2 weeks after I moved, there was a knock on my door late one evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I looked through the peephole and froze. It was my mom. She hadn't called or texted to say she was coming, she just showed up. She looked disheveled, holding a folder of papers in one hand and a suitcase in the other. She said she needed help and had driven all the way to the city because she couldn't handle things on her own anymore. She didn't wait for an invitation, just stepped inside and started unpacking her things as if she planned to stay. Then she pulled out the folder, showing me documents from a doctor who had supposedly diagnosed her with a rare condition. I skimmed through them, and something didn't add up. The dates were old, and the information was vague. When I asked for clarification, she deflected, saying the situation was complicated. I told her she couldn't stay. I said I had a busy schedule and no room for a long-term guest. She accused me of being heartless, saying I was turning my back on her when she needed me most. I held firm, even though it wasn't easy. Eventually, she packed up and left, but not before making a dramatic scene in the hallway, loudly sobbing about how I didn't care if she lived or died. A day later, I got a call from one of my cousins. Apparently, my mom had told the family she'd collapsed on the drive home and had to be taken to the hospital. I asked for details, but none of them knew anything concrete, just that she claimed her condition was getting worse. It felt like a pattern. Every time I set a boundary, she'd escalate her behavior to make herself the victim. Around this time, I started seeing a therapist. I didn't mention my mom at first, just said I was having trouble adjusting to all the changes in my life. But as we talked more, it became clear that a lot of my stress was tied to her. The therapist helped me understand that her behavior wasn't just about this one move. It was part of a bigger pattern of control and manipulation that had been going on for years. Meanwhile, my mom started posting cryptic updates on Facebook. Things like, "Some people forget who raised them," and "It's heartbreaking to be abandoned by the one person you thought would always be there." Mutual family members kept tagging me in the comments, asking if everything was okay. I decided to dig a little deeper. I started reading up on narcissistic parenting and emotional manipulation, and it felt like everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about her being upset that I moved out. It was about control. For the first time, I began to see how much her behavior had shaped my life and how important it was to finally break free. Update 2. A couple of weeks after my mom's unexpected visit, I got a text from her late at night. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It was another long message about how hard things were for her and how she wished I would come home. But then, an hour later, another text came through. This one wasn't meant for me. It read, "Don't worry, I'll figure something out to get him back here. I just need him to think I can't manage alone." It took me a second to process what I was looking at. My mom had accidentally sent me a message meant for someone else, and it was clear proof she wasn't as helpless or sick as she'd been claiming. She was planning something. My first instinct was to screenshot the message and send it to a family member who had always been on my side, my aunt. She read the message and called me immediately. Over the phone, my aunt admitted she wasn't surprised. Apparently, my mom had pulled similar stunts in the past with other family members, though not to this extent. She shared stories about how my mom would exaggerate problems to get sympathy or help, like saying she couldn't afford bills when she actually had money saved up. Hearing this gave me the confidence to start piecing things together more critically. I decided to dig deeper into her supposed illness. I texted her back saying I was worried and asking for detailed medical proof of her condition. She dodged the question entirely, replying that it was too personal and accusing me of being invasive. When I asked if she needed help scheduling another doctor's appointment, she ignored that too. That's when I turned to her social media. I hadn't been following her posts, but I figured it was worth checking. Sure enough, there were photos from a dinner party she attended a week after her visit to my apartment. She looked perfectly fine, smiling, laughing, holding a glass of wine. One photo even showed her eating a dessert that she had claimed her condition didn't allow. It was like she wasn't even trying to keep her story straight. I decided to test her. I called and offered to pay for a specialist appointment at a renowned clinic in her area. I told her it would give her the best care and put my mind at ease. She hesitated before declining, saying the travel would be too much for her, even though the clinic was only a 30-minute drive away. When I pushed, she got defensive, claiming she didn't need me micromanaging her health. A few days later, I got another call from my aunt. She had overheard my mom joking to another family member about how she had no choice but to pull out the big guns when I moved away. It was like a light bulb went off in my head. Everything she'd been doing, the illness, the guilt tripping, the unannounced visits, was just a way to reel me back in. Armed with all this information, I decided it was time to confront her. I called her and laid out everything. The text she sent by mistake, the social media posts, the stories from my aunt. I didn't accuse her outright, but asked her to explain the inconsistencies. She exploded. She called me ungrateful, claimed I was twisting her words, and insisted the photos were taken during a good day when her symptoms weren't as bad. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me. The fallout was immediate. Half my family took my side, saying it was about time someone stood up to her manipulative behavior. The other half accused me of being cruel and disrespectful. My mom took to Facebook again, this time posting a long, dramatic status about how I was spreading lies about her and tearing the family apart. She got a few sympathetic comments, but I noticed that most people didn't engage with her post. Around this time, I started seeing real progress in therapy. I talked to my therapist about everything, and she helped me see that my mom's behavior wasn't my fault. I started focusing on my life in the city, building friendships, excelling at work, and enjoying the freedom I'd never had before. It felt like I was finally living for myself, not for someone else's expectations. Then came the final straw. My mom sent me a message saying she was cutting me out of her will unless I apologized and came to my senses. I couldn't help but laugh when I read it. I replied that she could do whatever she wanted with her money and that I wasn't interested in playing games. After that, she went silent. She started giving me the cold shoulder, refusing to contact me directly but continuing to post vague updates online. Every now and then, a family member would forward me one of her posts, but I stopped responding. I'd had enough. The truth is, cutting ties, or at least minimizing contact, was the best decision I've ever made. My job was going great, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. The more distance I put between us, the more I realized how much of my life had been shaped by her manipulation. I couldn't change her, but I could change how much power she had over me. Update 3. After months of silence from my mom, I woke up to a long voicemail from her. She sounded tearful, apologizing for everything that had happened and admitting that she just couldn't bear the thought of losing me. She said she realized how much she'd hurt me and wanted to fix things. Her tone was softer than I'd ever heard, and for a moment it seemed like maybe she was finally trying to change. A few days later, a package showed up at my door. It was from her. Inside were some of my favorite snacks, a book one mentioned wanting months ago, and a handwritten letter. In the letter, she apologized again, saying she missed me and wanted to rebuild our relationship. It felt sincere enough that I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt, at least for now. We arranged a video call to catch up. She started off talking about how proud she was of me for making the move and how much she regretted how things had gone before. It was nice to hear, and I thought maybe we could actually move forward. Then, in the middle of the conversation, she casually mentioned a fun trip she had taken with friends during the time she'd claimed to be too sick to even leave the house. Hearing that set off alarm bells. I didn't call her out right then. I just let her keep talking. But the more she shared, the more obvious it became that her apology might not be as genuine as it seemed. Later, I talked about it with my therapist, who advised me to stay cautious and keep observing her actions before trusting her again. Sure enough, within a week, she started pushing boundaries. She would ask subtle but pointed questions about my finances, whether my job paid well, if I had savings, or if I was planning to buy a car. She brought it up as if she were just curious, but it felt like she was fishing for something. Then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that things were a little tight for her lately and asked if I might be able to help out down the line. I told her firmly that I was focusing on building my own life and wouldn't be able to support her financially. At first, she played it off, saying she didn't mean anything by it. But not long after, I started getting passive-aggressive texts about how it's hard being alone in your old age and how she hoped I never had to experience that kind of loneliness. Then came the Facebook posts. She started sharing cryptic statuses like, "It's heartbreaking when the people you love forget who raised them," or "Some bridges shouldn't be burned." She didn't mention my name, but the timing made it clear they were about me. A cousin even reached out, saying my mom had been complaining about being abandoned but conveniently left out the part where she had apologized and tried to reconcile. I noticed a pattern. Every time I posted something positive, like a promotion at work or a fun weekend with friends, her behavior would escalate. The texts would ramp up, the guilt trips would get heavier, and the Facebook statuses would turn more dramatic. It was like she couldn't stand to see me happy without her. Things came to a head during the holidays. I was hosting a small Friendsgiving at my apartment when there was a knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so I opened it, and there she was, standing there with a pie and a forced smile. She said she wanted to surprise me and join the celebration. It was awkward, to say the least. My friends were polite, but the tension was palpable. After dinner, I pulled her aside and confronted her. I told her I appreciated the effort to reconnect, but the guilt trips and manipulation needed to stop. She started crying, saying she was just trying to make things right, but then quickly shifted to blaming me for pushing her away. She deflected every point I made, turning the conversation into a pity party about how hard her life was. That night, after she left, I realized I couldn't keep putting her feelings above my own well-being. Every time I gave her an inch, she found a way to take a mile. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't sustainable. I decided then and there to stop letting her dictate how I lived my life. The next day, I blocked her on Facebook and muted her messages. I didn't cut her off entirely. I still wanted to keep some lines of communication open, but I needed to create distance. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of the situation. She didn't take it well. The next week, I heard from another family member that she'd been telling people I'd disowned her. I didn't bother correcting it. At this point, I knew her narrative would always paint her as the victim, and I wasn't going to waste energy fighting it. Looking back, that holiday was a turning point for me. I finally understood that no matter how much I wanted her to change, I couldn't force it. All I could do was protect my own peace and keep moving forward. Update 4. A few weeks after the holiday incident, I thought things were settling down. My mom had gone quiet, and for a moment it seemed like the distance was finally sticking. That didn't last long. One morning, I walked into work to find my boss waiting for me with a concerned look. Apparently, my mom had called the office, claiming to be my emergency contact. She told them she couldn't reach me and was worried something had happened. My boss was polite about it, but made it clear that personal issues needed to stay out of the workplace. I was mortified. I apologized profusely and assured them it wouldn't happen again. As soon as I got home, I removed her as my emergency contact on every form I could think of. Work, doctor's office, everything. It was a wake-up call that she wasn't going to respect my boundaries. That night, I started researching legal options to prevent further intrusions. A friend recommended consulting a lawyer, so I set up a meeting. The lawyer walked me through steps like documenting her behavior and sending a formal letter warning her to stop. It wasn't the route I wanted to take, but knowing I had options gave me some peace of mind. Then came the Facebook meltdown. My mom posted a lengthy rant tagging me and several family members, accusing me of abandoning her and tearing the family apart. She included personal details, like how she had supposedly supported me through everything, and how I had turned my back on her when she needed me most. The post gained traction, with some family members chiming in to agree, while others messaged me privately to express their disbelief. The fallout led to a family intervention, though not for me. A few relatives who had seen through her behavior decided to confront her. They showed up at her house to talk about how her actions were pushing everyone away. From what I heard later, it didn't go well. She deflected, accused them of taking my side, and doubled down on her narrative of being the victim. Her retaliation came quickly. She started calling relatives to accuse me of turning the family against her. Some believed her, but others saw it as another manipulation tactic. The more she tried to spin the story, the more isolated she became. Meanwhile, I focused on strengthening my support network. I shared the full story with the family members and friends who had stuck by me. It felt good to have people who understood what I was dealing with and didn't judge me for it. Their support reminded me that I wasn't alone, even if I had to distance myself from her. After the Facebook incident, I decided to take the final step. I blocked her on every platform and changed my phone number. I didn't announce it or make a big deal out of it. I just quietly made the changes and informed the people in my life who needed to know. It felt like cutting off the last thread of control she had over me. She didn't give up, though. Over the next few weeks, she sent emails and handwritten letters to my new address. Some were full of apologies and pleas for forgiveness, while others were more accusatory, blaming me for her problems. One letter included a photo of us from when I was a kid, with a note saying, "I hope you don't forget who's always been there for you." Another hinted at how I would regret this decision someday. Despite the guilt these messages stirred up, therapy helped me keep my perspective. My therapist reminded me that it wasn't my job to fix her or make her happy. That realization was freeing, but it didn't make the process any less painful. One surprising outcome of all this was hearing from family members I hadn't spoken to in years. Several reached out to share their own experiences with her manipulation. One cousin told me about a time she had guilted him into lending her money she never paid back. Another relative said they distanced themselves years ago for similar reasons. Their stories validated my decision and made me realize just how deep her patterns ran. Around this time, a milestone at work reminded me of how far I'd come. I was recognized for leading a successful project, something I never would have been able to focus on if I'd stayed stuck in the cycle of her demands. The achievement felt like proof that I was building a life for myself, free from her influence. The final straw came a month later when I received a letter from her with veiled threats. She wrote that if I didn't reconnect with her soon, I would regret it for the rest of my life. That was the moment I knew I was done. There was no reasoning with her, no hope of a healthy relationship. I kept the letter as documentation but didn't respond. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly free. The guilt still lingered occasionally, but it didn't outweigh the relief of knowing I had control over my life. Cutting ties wasn't easy, but it was the only way to protect my peace and move forward. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally moving forward. Update 5. After cutting ties with my mom, my life changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without her constant interference, I had space to focus on myself for the first time. It was a strange adjustment, but it didn't take long for me to realize how much better things were without the stress and drama she brought into my life. At work, I was thriving. With no distractions pulling my focus, I poured myself into my projects and started seeing real results. My boss took notice, and within a few months, I was promoted. The recognition felt incredible, especially since it was something I had earned entirely on my own. It was a stark contrast to the years I spent trying to meet impossible expectations at home, only to be told I wasn't doing enough. My personal life started to blossom too. I grew closer to the friends who had supported me through everything, and I even reconnected with some family members who had distanced themselves from my mom years ago. One relative, in particular, became a strong ally. She shared her own experiences with my mom's manipulation, and we bonded over our shared struggles. Having that support made me feel less alone and more confident in my decision to set boundaries. Around this time, I started dating someone new. They were kind, patient, and supportive, everything I hadn't realized I needed. They never tried to pressure me to reconnect with my mom or fix things. Instead, they encouraged me to prioritize my well-being and set boundaries that felt right for me. It was the healthiest relationship I'd ever been in, and it helped me see what a positive, supportive connection could look like. Therapy continued to be a major part of my healing process. My therapist helped me untangle years of guilt and understand the patterns that had defined my relationship with my mom. It wasn't an overnight fix, but each session gave me tools to move forward. Slowly, I stopped second-guessing my choices and started trusting myself more. I also began to recognize how much of my mom's behavior was rooted in her own unresolved issues. While I couldn't change her, I could choose not to let those issues dictate my life anymore. The real test came unexpectedly. A few months later, I attended a family gathering and ran into my mom. I hadn't seen her in person since the last holiday fiasco, and the encounter was tense from the start. She approached me with a forced smile and started asking how I'd been, slipping in subtle comments about how much she'd missed me and how hard things had been for her. I stayed calm and kept my responses polite but firm. When she started bringing up the past, I reiterated my boundaries and made it clear that I wasn't interested in rehashing old conflicts. Other family members overheard the conversation, and to my surprise, several of them backed me up. They called her out on her guilt tripping and told her to let it go. For once, the spotlight wasn't on me to defend myself, it was on her to own up to her behavior. After that encounter, my mom shifted her tactics. She started telling people she had forgiven me, framing herself as the bigger person. It was frustrating, but I let it go. At this point, I realized her version of events would always paint her in the best light, and I wasn't going to waste energy correcting the narrative. What mattered was that I was finally free from her control. With that chapter behind me, I started focusing on things I had put off for years. I picked up hobbies I'd always been interested in but never had time for. I joined a local hiking group, started cooking more elaborate meals at home, and even took a weekend road trip with friends. For the first time, my life felt like it was truly mine. When the holidays rolled around, I decided to host a small gathering at my apartment. It was just a handful of friends and a couple of family members I trusted, but it felt like a fresh start. We cooked together, laughed, and created new traditions that were free from the tension and drama of my childhood. It was a reminder that family isn't just the one you're born into, it's the people who genuinely care about you and support you. Every now and then, my mom still tries to reach out. She sends the occasional letter, usually neutral in tone, asking how I'm doing and saying she hopes we can talk someday. I've chosen not to respond. I don't hold any resentment toward her, but I also know that reconnecting on her terms would only pull me back into the cycle I worked so hard to escape. Looking back, the biggest lesson I've learned is the importance of boundaries. Setting them wasn't easy, and enforcing them was even harder, but it was the only way to reclaim my life. I can't control how my mom behaves or what she chooses to believe, but I can control how I respond and who I allow into my space. I don't know what the future holds for my relationship with her. If she ever shows real change, I'm open to the idea of reconciliation. But for now, I'm at peace with where things stand. I've built a life that makes me happy, surrounded by people who genuinely care about me, and that's something I'm not willing to compromise again.